Think about the last time you learned something that you couldn't unlearn. Maybe it was understanding why the sky is blue, or realizing that every tree you see was once a tiny seed, or grasping why ice floats on water. Once you understood it, really understood it, you couldn't go back to not knowing. The interesting thing is, that's not just a figure of speech. Your brain, physically, isn't the same as it was before. And right now, as these words reach you, something similar is happening. Let's start with something straightforward. Your brain is made of about 86 billion neurons. Now, that number is thrown around a lot. But what does it actually mean? Each of those neurons connects to thousands of others, creating something like 100 trillion connections. These connections, called synapses, are where the interesting stuff happens. They're not static. They're changing all the time, strengthening when they're used, weakening when they're ignored, even creating entirely new pathways. Here's where it gets fascinating. Every time you understand something new, you're literally rewiring these connections. It's not a metaphor. Scientists can measure this. When someone learns to juggle, for instance, scans show increased gray matter in areas of the brain that handle visual and motor coordination. Stop juggling for a few months, and those changes start to fade. The brain is constantly sculpting itself based on what it does. But understanding something, really grasping a concept, does something different than just learning a skill. It creates what we might call an irreversible shift. Think about optical illusions. Take one of those images that looks like a vase until someone points out it's also two faces looking at each other. The moment you see both, you can't unsee them. Your brain has created a new pattern of recognition. The visual information hasn't changed, but your internal model of what you're looking at has expanded. This happens because of how the brain processes information. It's not like a computer that stores data in neat files. Instead, it creates models, patterns of expectation about how the world works. When you encounter something new, the brain doesn't just record it. It tries to fit it into existing patterns. If it doesn't fit, the brain has to do something harder. It has to restructure those patterns. That restructuring is what we experience as understanding. Let's use a simple example. Imagine you've never thought about why ships float. You might have a vague sense that they just do, maybe because they're shaped right or made of the right materials. But then someone explains displacement. The ship pushes water out of the way, and if the weight of that displaced water is more than the weight of the ship floats. Suddenly, you understand not just ships, but why a steel needle sinks, but a steel ship floats, why you feel lighter in a pool, why icebergs are dangerous below the surface. One principle unlocks dozens of phenomena. That moment of understanding involves several things happening in the brain at once. First, there's pattern completion. Different parts of the brain that handle different aspects of the concept, visual, logical, spatial, start firing in sync. This synchronized activity strengthens the connections between these regions. Second, there's prediction. Once you understand displacement, your brain starts automatically predicting what will happen in similar situations. See a rock? It'll sink. See a log? Might float. Depends on the wood. This prediction mechanism is constantly running in the background, refining your model. But here's what makes certain insights special. They change the questions you ask. Before understanding displacement, you might wonder about specific cases. Why does this float? Why does that sink? After understanding, you start asking different questions. What determines density? How do submarines control their depth? The insight opens up new territory to explore. This is why some ideas are called generative. They don't just answer questions, they generate new ones. There's a deeper layer to this. Some concepts change not just what you know, but how you perceive. Consider the idea that everything you see is actually in the past. Light takes time to travel, so when you look at something across the room, you're seeing it as it was a few nanoseconds ago. Look at the sun, and you're seeing it as it was 8 minutes ago. Look at a distant star, and you might be seeing light that began its journey before humans existed on Earth. This isn't just trivia. It fundamentally shifts how you think about now. It reveals that simultaneity, the idea that things happen at the same moment, is more complicated than it seems. Once you grasp this, you start noticing it everywhere. You realize that when you're having a conversation, you're responding to words that were spoken milliseconds ago. The present moment is thinner than you thought. This type of understanding doesn't just add information. It restructures your basic intuitions about reality. The brain seems to have different types of understanding. There's shallow understanding, where you can repeat information or follow steps without really grasping why. Then there's deep understanding, where you can apply the principle in new situations, explain it in different ways, and see its connections to other ideas. The difference between these isn't just how much you know, it's how integrated that knowledge is with the rest of what you know. Think about learning to read. At first, letters are just shapes. Then you learn that shapes correspond to sounds. Then that combinations of sounds make words. Then that words carry meaning. But something interesting happens as you practice. Eventually, You stop seeing letters at all. You just see meaning. The process becomes automatic, invisible. Try to look at a word in a language you can read and not read it. You can't. The understanding has become so integrated into your brain's processing that it's no longer optional. This automaticity is powerful, but it also means that truly understanding something changes your raw perception, not just your interpretation. A musician hearing a symphony hears things a non-musician doesn't. Not because they're thinking harder about it, but because their perceptual systems have been restructured. They've trained their brains to automatically detect patterns, harmonies, and structures that others miss. Now, here's where it connects to this moment, right now. The act of explaining how understanding changes the brain is itself changing your brain. There's a recursive quality to it. Knowing that your brain rewires itself as you learn makes you more aware of that process. And that awareness can influence how you approach learning. It's like discovering that you can feel your own heartbeat. The heart was always beating, but now you're conscious of it. And that consciousness can even affect the rhythm. Some neuroscientists talk about metacognition, thinking about thinking. Humans seem to be unusually good at this. Not only do we learn, but we can reflect on how we learn, and we can use those reflections to learn better. This creates a feedback loop. Understanding how understanding works makes you better at understanding. It's a strange loop, the kind that shows up in consciousness itself. Consider what happens when you learn that memories aren't fixed recordings. Every time you remember something, you're reconstructing it, and in that reconstruction, you can actually change the memory. This means that remembering changes what you remember. Once you know this, you start noticing it. You catch yourself being uncertain about details. You recognize when a memory feels more like a story you've told yourself than a direct experience. The knowledge changes your relationship with your own past. Or take the concept of cognitive biases. Learn about confirmation bias, the tendency to notice evidence that supports what you already believe and ignore evidence against it, and you start catching yourself doing it. Not always. The bias doesn't disappear just because you know about it. But sometimes you'll be in an argument and suddenly think, wait, am I just looking for reasons to be right? That moment of recognition is your brain using its model of itself to check its own processes. It's like having a mirror that shows you not just your face, but your expressions as they form. The brain's plasticity, this ability to rewire itself, isn't unlimited. It's easier when you're young. Children learn languages, musical instruments, and complex skills with a fluidity that adults often envy. This is because young brains are in a heightened state of plasticity. The connections are forming rapidly, and the structures are still flexible. But plasticity doesn't disappear with age. It continues throughout life. It slows down, certainly, and it takes more effort. But it's always there. People in their 70 seconds and 80 seconds can learn new languages, take up instruments, master new skills. The brain never fully stops being able to change. What does change is efficiency. Young brains are exploring, making lots of connections, trying different patterns. Adult brains are more specialized. They've kept the connections that proved useful and pruned away the ones that didn't. This specialization makes adults better at things they know, but slower at learning completely new things. It's a trade-off. You gain expertise, but lose some flexibility. But here's a curious fact. Certain types of learning seem to maintain or even increase plasticity. Learning itself might keep the brain more plastic. There's evidence that people who regularly learn new things, who keep challenging themselves with unfamiliar skills or ideas, maintain cognitive flexibility longer. The brain treated as a learning organ stays a learning organ. Use it or lose it, as the saying goes. But the use here specifically means using it for learning, not just for familiar tasks. This brings up an interesting question. What's the optimal way to structure learning if you want to genuinely understand something rather than just memorize it? The research points to a few principles. First, spacing. Learning a little bit over many sessions works better than cramming everything into one session. The brain seems to consolidate understanding during rest, particularly during sleep. When you learn something, then sleep, then come back to it, the connections have had time to stabilize. Second, retrieval. Testing yourself, trying to recall information, strengthens understanding more than just reviewing it. This is counterintuitive, because retrieval feels harder and reviewing feels easier. But that difficulty is actually the point. When you struggle to recall something, you're forcing your brain to strengthen those pathways. Easy repetition doesn't create the same effect. Third, connection. Understanding deepens when you connect new information to things you already know. This is why analogies work so well. They take something unfamiliar and link it to something familiar, creating a bridge that your brain can cross. Once the bridge exists, the new concept becomes part of your integrated knowledge network rather than an isolated fact. There's also the question of attention. Understanding requires focused attention in a way that superficial processing doesn't. This matters more now than ever because attention is increasingly fragmented. Constant interruptions, notifications, quick switches between tasks. These all interfere with the kind of sustained focus that deep understanding requires. The brain needs time to settle into a problem, to play with it, to let different regions communicate and find patterns. Interruptions break this process. But when that process works, when understanding clicks into place, there's often a feeling of satisfaction, sometimes even pleasure. This isn't just psychological. The brain releases dopamine when patterns are recognized, when predictions prove accurate, when understanding emerges. This reward system encourages learning. It's why puzzles can be addictive, why solving a difficult problem feels good, why that aha moment is pleasurable. The brain is essentially rewarding itself for getting better at modeling the world. And here's something worth sitting with. The world you experience is your brain's model of the world, not the world itself. Light hits your retinas, but you don't see the electrical signals in your optic nerve. You see objects, colors, movement. Sound waves hit your eardrums, but you don't hear vibrations. You hear words, music, meaning. The brain takes raw sensory data and constructs an experience. That experience is remarkably good at matching reality. Good enough that you usually don't notice it's a construction, but it is. This means that when you deepen your understanding of something, you're not just adding information to your mental library. You're actually changing the world as you experience it. A person who understands music theory hears music differently than someone who doesn't. A person who understands physics sees motion differently. A person who understands psychology interprets behavior differently. The external reality hasn't changed, but the experienced reality has. This is why teaching can be so powerful. When you explain something to someone else and they genuinely understand it, you've literally altered their experienced reality. You've given them a new way of seeing, and often, explaining something forces you to understand it better yourself. You have to find the right words, the right analogies, anticipate confusions. This process refines your own understanding. Teaching and learning aren't separate. They're both forms of cognitive restructuring. Now, notice what's happened during these past minutes. Various concepts have been explained. Neuroplasticity, pattern recognition, the construction of perception, the integration of knowledge. But more than that, a perspective has been offered. That understanding isn't passive reception of information, but active reconstruction of mental models. And that this reconstruction is physical, measurable, real. If this perspective makes sense, if it's clicked into place, then something has shifted. Not just new facts added to old knowledge, but a new framework for thinking about knowledge itself. This is what certain insights do. They provide not just answers, but new frameworks for generating answers. They're tools for thinking. And like any tool, once you have it, you use it automatically. You don't think, now I'll apply my understanding of displacement when you wonder whether something will float. You just know immediately. The understanding has become part of how you perceive. So when the title suggested that, after watching this, your brain won't be the same, it wasn't hyperbole. The connections that existed in your brain before these words are not identical to the connections that exist now. Some synapses have strengthened, some patterns have formed or deepened. The change might be small, might be temporary if the ideas aren't revisited, but it's there. It's measurable, in principle, if we had detailed enough scans. But beyond the immediate neural changes, there's the possibility of something more lasting. If the core idea resonates, if it becomes part of how you think about learning and understanding, then it will influence future learning. You might pay more attention to moments when understanding clicks into place. You might notice the difference between memorizing and truly grasping. You might approach difficult concepts with more patience, knowing that understanding takes time and that the brain needs to build new structures. These changes in approach could compound over time, making you more effective at learning, which makes you learn more, which makes you better at learning. Another feedback loop. There's something profound in realizing that you're always in the middle of this process. You're never finished understanding. There's no moment when your brain stops being plastic, stops rewiring itself in response to experience. Every conversation, every book, every observation is potentially changing the structure of your thoughts. Most changes are small, temporary, but some are significant. Some genuinely shift how you see everything else. And here's the curious thing about these significant shifts. You often can't fully understand them until after they've happened. Before learning that light has a speed and that means seeing is always seeing the past, you can't quite imagine what that understanding will feel like. Before grasping how memories change when remembered, you can't predict how it will change your relationship with your past. The understanding has to restructure your thinking before you can think from within that restructured framework. This means that learning, real learning, always involves a leap into something you can't fully anticipate. There's an element of trust that the confusion will resolve, that the pieces will eventually fit together, that the brain will do its work of pattern finding and integration, and usually, if you stay with it, it does. The confusion clears. Things make sense. Not all at once, usually, but gradually. And then one day you realize you understand something that once seemed impossibly complex. The brain is capable of this because it's not a fixed machine. It's a living system that shapes itself in response to the world. It's designed, if that's the right word, to learn. That's its primary function. Not storing information, though it does that. Not processing data, though it does that too. But learning, adapting, updating its models, getting better at predicting and understanding. This is what brains do. And so, having traced through these ideas, having followed the logic from synapses to perception to understanding to change, what's the takeaway? Perhaps it's this. Be conscious of what you expose your mind to, what you practice, what you think about, because all of it is shaping the organ that does the experiencing. The brain you have tomorrow will be different from the brain you have today. The only question is how it will be different and whether those differences will serve you. You're always becoming someone slightly different. The world you experience is always being reconstructed. Understanding this doesn't stop the process. Nothing can stop it. But understanding might give you some say in the direction, and that in itself changes everything.